In 1847, a survey crew working for the federal government along the southern shore of Lake Superior pulled a copper-sheathed object from the lakebed sediment that none of them had a name for. It was approximately 9 feet across at its widest point, roughly cylindrical, and lined on the interior with a ceramic compound that, according to the field notes, had been fused at temperatures requiring sustained heat sources, not campfires, not kilns of the type then known to be used in the region, but something more deliberate, more engineered, more permanent. The crew foreman, a man named Josiah Caruth, wrote in his survey log that the structure appeared to have been in regular use before the water claimed it. He estimated, based on the wear patterns he could see and the sediment layering above it, that whatever had operated here had done so for years. Not days, not a single season. Years of continuous use, and then silence, and then the lake. That is the part I keep returning to. I came to this the way I come to most of these, through a side door, following something unrelated, not expecting what I found at the end of it. I was tracing the copper extraction records from the early Lake Superior mining corridor, specifically the anomalous output numbers from the years between 1843 and 1860, trying to understand why federal surveyors kept filing addendums to their official reports. Quiet supplemental notes, separate from the main document, sometimes held in a different box entirely at the National Archives Annex in Chicago. Not redactions, not erasures, just a second layer of documentation that existed slightly apart from the first, as if certain observations needed to be recorded somewhere, but did not need to be found easily. One of those addendums led me to Caruth's field log, and Caruth's field log led me somewhere I have spent the better part of 2 years trying to understand. By the time this reaches you, you will have heard the standard account of pre-contact copper use in the Great Lakes region. The tools, the trade networks, the old copper complex, the set of cultures that archaeologists date to somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 years ago. People who hammered native copper into projectile points and hooks and ornaments through cold working techniques, shaping the metal without heat, without furnaces, using stone tools and accumulated skill. That account is real. The evidence supporting it is extensive and well documented, and I am not here to argue against it. But it is not the complete story, because what Caruth's crew pulled from the lakebed in 1847 does not fit inside it. What they found was a furnace. Consider what that distinction means. Cold working copper requires no heat at all. It requires only the metal and a harder material to shape it, plus the patience to work it slowly. Smelting is something else entirely. Smelting requires sustained, controlled, high temperatures. It requires an understanding of how metal behaves under heat, how to build a structure that can contain and direct that heat, how to line the walls with a compound that will survive repeated firings without degrading. The ceramic lining Caruth described in his field notes, the chamber geometry, the evidence of repeated high-temperature use, those are the signatures of metallurgical processing, of a technology that, according to the accepted academic timeline for this region, should not have existed before European contact. And Caruth's own assessment of the sediment layering above the object placed its last period of active use well before the first European copper operations on Lake Superior, by a margin he could not calculate precisely, but clearly believed was substantial. He did not know what he had found, but he knew it did not belong in the story he had been given about this region. The crew made technical drawings. Photographs were not yet standard practice for field surveys of this type. And Caruth forwarded the main report to the General Land Office in Washington, with a notation indicating that certain findings of an unusual character had been retained in a supplemental file, pending further review by qualified parties. That phrasing, pending further review by qualified parties, appears in 3 other addendum notifications from that era. In 2 of those cases, the supplemental files exist. The findings were reviewed, the files were cataloged, and if you know which boxes to request, you can read them today. In Carruth's case, that is not what happened. There is a box in the National Archives Great Lakes Regional Collection, cataloged under survey materials from the 1840s Michigan Territory assessments, that contains field notes from 14 separate expeditions. 13 of those expeditions have their supplemental addendums intact, cross-referenced with their main reports, accessible in the standard finding aids. The 14th, Carruth's 1847 survey of the southern Superior shoreline, has a main report and an empty sleeve where the addendum should be. The sleeve is labeled. The label is in a different handwriting than the rest of the collection, and the label was written in pencil over what appears to be an earlier ink notation that was partially erased. Someone filed it. Someone else came back for it later. This is where the story becomes harder to follow, and I want to be careful here, because harder to follow is not the same as impossible to follow. There is still a thread, because Carruth did not give up on what he found. He was a practical man, a career government surveyor, not given to what he described in a letter to his brother in 1849 as idle speculation about things better left to men of science. But he wrote to his brother about the furnace. He described it in more detail than his official notes allowed, the way the ceramic interior had been built up in distinct layers, each layer a slightly different mineral composition, as if whoever built it had been refining the mixture across multiple firings, learning from each attempt, adjusting the formula. He described markings on the copper sheathing that did not match any tool typology he had been trained to recognize in his years of regional survey work. And he wrote something I have read perhaps 50 times since I first came across the letter in a collection at the Wisconsin Historical Society. He wrote that when he held a compass near the object, the needle did not behave as it should. Not wildly. Not dramatically. Just slightly wrong, as if the object had some effect on the local magnetic field that he could not account for, and had no framework to explain. He did not know what to make of it. Neither do I. But I wrote it down, and I am telling you about it, because I do not think we get to decide which details are worth including and which ones can be quietly set aside. What I can trace with more confidence is what happened 41 years later. In 1888, a geologist named Warren Upham, conducting an independent survey of glacial deposits along the Superior Basin, filed a preliminary report with the University of Michigan that referenced a submerged structural feature at approximately the same coordinates Carruth had recorded in 1847. Upham had not read Carruth's report. There is no indication he was aware it existed. He arrived at the site through a completely separate line of inquiry, following accounts from Ojibwe fishermen in the region who described a section of the lake bed where their nets sometimes caught on something that was not rock and not a natural formation. Upham organized a diving survey and confirmed the presence of a large, non-natural submerged structure. He noted the ceramic composition of the interior lining in terms that closely match Carruth's description, despite Upham having no access to Carruth's notes. He collected 3 physical samples from the interior ceramic lining and sent them to the University of Michigan's Geology Department for laboratory analysis. The analysis came back in the spring of 1889. The mineralogist who performed it, whose name appears in the university's internal correspondence of that period, but in no published paper before or since, reported that the ceramic composition indicated firing temperatures far in excess of what open hearth or simple kiln methods of the pre-industrial period could sustain in that region. He wrote that the composition was consistent with deliberate, high-temperature metallurgical processing. He wrote that it was inconsistent with any known indigenous technology of the Great Lakes, as then understood by the academic literature. He recommended formal publication and further excavation at the site, and he used the word significant 3 times in a 4-page report. which for a university mineralogist in 1889 was not understated enthusiasm. He also noted, in a section added after the main analysis, that the layering pattern of the ceramic interior, the way the composition shifted in measurable increments from one stratum to the next, was suggestive of iterative development over a long period of time, not a single act of construction. A process. Someone had built this, fired it, assessed the results, refined the material, rebuilt the lining, and fired it again, many times. The object documented in those samples was the end product of an extended, disciplined accumulation of knowledge about how to make fire do a specific kind of work on metal. The formal publication never happened. And that is where I would have expected the trail to end. A promising finding, an institutional hesitation, a silence. But there was something else, and I did not find it until I had been in this material for nearly 18 months. There is a personal diary belonging to Frederick Hodge, who worked as an ethnographic researcher for the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington beginning in 1889. Hodge's published work focused on Pueblo cultures in the Southwest, and he is well known in the relevant literature. His diary, covering 1889 through 1893, is held at the Smithsonian Institution Archives and has been consulted by researchers working on his better-known subjects. But there is an entry from October of 1889 that, as far as I can determine, has never been cited in any published work on the Lake Superior region. In it, Hodge mentions receiving a letter from a colleague at the University of Michigan describing an underwater metallurgical feature on the Superior lakebed that had been analyzed and found anomalous in ways that could not be reconciled with the existing literature. He writes that he intended to raise the matter with the Bureau's director. 2 weeks later, a single line, "The matter of the Michigan feature has been referred elsewhere, and I am told it is not for the Bureau." Referred elsewhere. He does not say where. He does not say who told him. Not for the Bureau. That phrase stayed with me. What happened instead was a letter from the university's provost to the geology department chair, dated March of 1889, advising that the Superior Basin findings be held in abeyance pending consultation with the Michigan Geological Survey, and with certain unnamed interested parties connected to regional copper extraction operations. The letter used the word proprietary twice. It used the word premature once. It did not use the word suppress. It did not need to, because the people writing these letters understood how institutional language worked, and they knew that the right combination of procedural words could make something disappear without anyone ever having to sign their name to a decision to bury it. The copper industry context is not incidental to any of this. By 1889, the Lake Superior mines were producing roughly 75% of the American copper supply. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company alone had revenue that year exceeding the gross domestic product of several American states. The infrastructure of the entire region, the towns, the roads, the political relationships between state government and private capital, had been built around the assumption that the copper deposits of the Superior Basin were an untapped natural resource that European descended enterprise had discovered and developed. That assumption was already historically incomplete, given what was known about the old copper complex and the ancient extraction pits on Isle Royale. But an ancient extraction pit is one thing. An ancient furnace is another thing entirely. A pit suggests harvesting. A furnace suggests industry, people who had developed, at some point before recorded contact, a metallurgical practice sophisticated enough to require purpose-built permanent infrastructure. A furnace on that lakebed would have introduced complications that certain parties had very specific financial reasons to prevent from entering the public record. Not because the complications would have been legally decisive, but because they would have been publicly visible. And publicly visible complications in 1889 were their own kind of problem for industries that depended on the quiet cooperation of government survey agencies, university geology departments, and federal ethnographic bureaus. The letter from the provost is in the University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library. I have read it. The correspondence between the Geology Department and the Michigan Geological Survey in the months following that letter has gaps. Approximately 3 months of letters missing from what is otherwise a continuous, well-preserved archive. The mineralogist's original analysis report exists in 2 copies, one in the Bentley collection and one in a private estate archive in Houghton, Michigan, donated to the County Historical Society in 2003 by the family of a retired attorney who had spent most of his career representing interests in the copper industry. That second copy has handwritten annotations in the margins. The handwriting, based on comparison with correspondence I was able to locate from the same period, matches an executive at Calumet and Hecla. Someone outside the university was reading that analysis before it was ever published. And it was never published. What happened next, I pieced together from a 1923 internal memo from the University of Michigan Archaeology Department, a document I found in a box of uncatalogued materials during a research visit to the Bentley in 2021, materials that had not been formally processed into the finding aids and would not have appeared in any standard search. The memo references the Superior Basin site in the past tense, treating it as known prior context rather than new information. It notes that a university-affiliated team had conducted a partial underwater survey of the site in 1902. It confirms that the structural features documented in 1847 and 1888 were still present and identifiable at that time. And then it states, in language that I have turned over many times since I first read it, that the decision had been made to allow the site to remain undisturbed and unregistered in the state archaeological inventory. That phrase, the decision had been made. Passive voice, no subject, no named decision-maker, no meeting recorded, no vote. Just the fact of the decision, presented as settled context, as if by 1923 everyone who needed to know already knew, and the only thing left to do was make a note for the file confirming that the site would stay exactly where it was and that no one outside a very narrow circle would know it existed. Undisturbed and unregistered are not the same thing. Undisturbed means no excavation. Unregistered means the site does not appear in the public inventory of archaeological features, which means no researcher coming to that region later, consulting the standard resources, would ever know to look for it. The decision was not just to leave it alone. The decision was to leave it alone in a way that prevented anyone else from ever choosing differently. This was not the only site of its kind to exit the accessible record in this corridor during this period. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters more here than anywhere else. I am not arguing that the entire archaeological framework for the Great Lakes is wrong, or that pre-contact smelting was widespread in ways that would overturn decades of careful scholarship. What I am saying is narrower and more disturbing for its narrowness. There is an 1871 Smithsonian Institution annual report containing a single paragraph referencing a structurally similar feature found during an Isle Royale survey that year. The paragraph cites a field report. The Smithsonian's own catalog from that period shows no record of that field report having been received. The Isle Royale feature is not mentioned again in any subsequent Smithsonian correspondence I have been able to locate. A finding emerged. A brief note was made in a summary document, and then the underlying documentation was simply not there. The mechanism of burial is almost always the same. A finding, a preliminary analysis, a moment of institutional hesitation, and then the finding exits the record, not through dramatic suppression or a detectable act of destruction, but through the quietest possible administrative gesture. A sleeve with nothing in it. A catalog entry with no corresponding file. A publication recommendation never acted upon. An empty slot in an archive where something should be, with a label in a different handwriting suggesting that someone had come back and made a decision about what would and would not remain findable. The people who built the furnace beneath Lake Superior understood something about heat and metal and material composition that we have not given them credit for understanding. The ceramic lining that Carruth encountered in 1847, that the University of Michigan's mineralogist characterized in 1889, was not an accident of geology or a natural formation. It was engineered. It was the product of accumulated technical knowledge, of trials conducted over many firings, of adjustments made and refined across generations of practice. That kind of knowledge does not live in a single person. It lives in a community, passed from one practitioner to the next through demonstration and repetition, surviving only as long as the continuity of that community survives. That continuity was broken, not by the lake, not by time, not by any natural process of forgetting. It was broken by displacement, by the destruction of the communities that carried this knowledge before anyone with the means to document it thought to ask what they knew. And then, the physical evidence of what they had built was quietly removed from the accessible record at precisely the moment when it might have prompted that question in retrospect. Not loudly, not with a policy or a directive, just with an empty sleeve and a note in pencil and a letter about proprietary interests and a memo confirming that the decision had been made. We cannot recover what they knew. The furnace is still there, somewhere in the sediment of the southern Superior Basin, at coordinates that appear in Carruth's log and in Upham's survey, and in a 1923 memo filed in a box that was never catalogued. The knowledge of how to build it, what it was for, what it meant about the people who made it, that is not retrievable. We destroyed the human continuity that would have carried it, and then we buried the evidence, and we did it so quietly, through such ordinary institutional mechanisms, that for most of the last century there was nothing visible to question. If this deserves to be heard, share it with someone who asks good questions. That is all I can ask.